Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Dead Game. All right, well, I appreciate you guys. So grab your cup of Jonah and join us here. Don't forget, if you haven't already, subscribe to phoneboothpodcast.substack.com. This morning, the last 12 days of readings have led up to today. Arguments and proof of the existence of God. We have now shown that the effort to demonstrate the existence of God is not a vain one. We shall therefore proceed to set forth the arguments by which both philosophers and Catholic teachers have proved that God exists. We shall first set forth the arguments by which Aristotle proceeds to prove that God exists. The aim of Aristotle is to do this in two ways, beginning with motion. Of these ways, the first is as follows, and this is from Aristotle's Physics. Everything that is moved by another. That some things are in motion, for example, the sun, is evident from sense. Therefore, it is moved by something else that moves it. This mover is itself either moved or not moved. If it is not, we have reached our conclusion, namely, that we must posit some unmoved mover. This we call God. If it is moved by another mover. We must consequently either proceed to infinity, or we must arrive at some unmoved mover. Now it is not possible to proceed to infinity, hence we must posit some prime unmoved mover. In this proof, there are two propositions that need to be proven, namely, that everything that is moved by another, and that in movers and things moved, one cannot proceed to infinity. The first of these propositions, Aristotle proves in three ways. The first way is as follows. If something moves itself, it must have within itself the principle of its own motion. Otherwise, it is clearly moved by another. Furthermore, it must be primarily moved. This means that it must be moved by reason of itself and not by reason of a part of itself, as happens when an animal is moved by the motion of its foot. For in this sense, a whole would not be moved by itself, but in part, and one part would be moved by another. It is also necessary that a self-moving being be divisible and have parts, since, as it is proven in the physics, whatever is moved is divisible. On the basis of these suppositions, Aristotle argues as follows. That which is held to be moved by itself is primarily moved. Hence, when one of its parts is at rest, the whole is then at rest. For if, while one part was at rest, another part in it were moved, then the whole itself would not be primarily moved. It would be that part in which is moved while another part is at rest. But nothing that is at rest, because something else is at rest, is moved by itself. For that being whose rest follows upon the rest of another must have its motion follow upon the motion of another. It is thus not moved by itself. Therefore, that which was posited as being moved by itself is not moved by itself. Consequently, everything that is moved must be moved by another. Nor is it an objection to this argument if one might say, when something is held to move itself, a part of it cannot be at rest. Or again, if one might say that a part is not subject to rest or motion except accidentally. Accidentally is like outside in its periphery, like part of it, not like some quality, not its substance. So the accident here is used in contrast to substance, or like substantially, which is the unfounded argument of Avicenna. Avicenna was one of the great Eastern philosophers back in the day. For indeed, the force of Aristotle's argument lies in this. If something moves itself primarily and through itself, rather than through its parts, that it is moved cannot depend on another, but the moving of the divisible itself, like its being, depends on its parts. It cannot therefore move itself primarily and through itself. Hence, for the truth of the inferred conclusion, it is not necessary to assume, as an absolute truth, that a part of a being moving itself is at rest. What must rather be true is this conditional proposition. If the part were at rest, the whole would be at rest. Now, this proposition would be true even though its antecedent be impossible. In the same way, the following conditional proposition is true. If man is an ass, he is irrational. In the second way, Aristotle proves the proposition by induction. Whatever is moved by accident, now in this sense, he means accident meaning outside of the intention of the mover, or outside of its own intention. This is why, like, when we say, oh, it was an accident, we're saying that wasn't my intention. I didn't intend for that to happen. Oops, it happened, right? So accident here means outside of the intention of the thing moving. So whatever is moved by accident is not moved by itself, since it is moved upon the motion of another. So too, as is evident, that is moved by what is moved by violence is not moved by itself. Nor are those beings moved by themselves that are moved by their nature as being moved from within. Such is the case with animals, which evidently are moved by the soul. Nor again is this true of those beings, such as heavy and light bodies, which are moved through nature, for such beings are moved by the generation, cause, and the cause of removing impediments. Now, whatever is moved through itself or by accident. If it is moved through itself, then it is moved either violently, meaning something else is moving it, right? Or by nature. If by nature, then either through itself as the animal, or not through itself as heavy and light bodies. Therefore, everything that is moved by another. What's up, Ted? Morning. In the third way, so it's interesting, you can see the subtlety and the thoroughness of the thought process here. He's like, all right, well, some things move by moving parts of their body. Some things are moved like a rock where it's not really intending to, it's violence in the sense of like going against its nature. Because if you pick up a rock and throw it, it belongs to the nature of the rock to fall to the earth through buoyancy, obviously. But if you throw it up, that's contrary to the motion that it naturally tends to, right? So that's what he's saying about violence. So, in the third way, Aristotle proves the proposition as follows, and this, I believe this again is in the Physics. The same thing cannot be at once in act and in potency with respect to the same thing. But everything which is moved, such as in potency, but everything that is moved is as such in potency. For motion is the act of something that is in potency, inasmuch as it is in potency. So what he means by potency here is like, if you have the potential, it's talking about the potential. When potential becomes actualized, this is very technical philosophical terminology from Aristotle's definitions, etc. So when we say something is an act, so motion is the act of the potency. So if anything ever changes, it means it had the potency to change. It had the power to change, or the ability to change, we would say, right? The reason why he doesn't say power or ability is because each of those have a precise nuance that we're not trying to get into yet, because some things move, some things are reduced to act, it's called, not of their own power, right? So that's the reason, is that we're not descending into a more precise term, this idea of potency and act. It's like motion is to rest as potency is to act. So when something moves, it's becoming, this potency inside of it is being actualized. And this will come up later, and we'll dig deeper into that later when we reflect on whether or not God can change. Very interesting stuff. That which moves, however, is as such in act, for nothing acts except according as it is in act. Therefore, with respect to this same motion, nothing is both mover and moved. Thus, nothing moves itself. In other words, you know that whole phrase that we have, that colloquial phrase, you can't give what you don't have. So in the same way, like my body can't move itself. I move, my soul moves my body. So my soul is acting on the matter of my body, the physical of my body. My body in and of itself is responding to, okay, electrical signals and things from the brain and the nervous system. That's how I move my body. But you could see that it requires something else. We'll get into that as well. It is to be noted, however, that Plato, who held that every mover is moved, understood the name of motion in a wider sense than did Aristotle. For Aristotle understood motion strictly, according as it is an act of what exists in potency, inasmuch as it is such. So understood, motion belongs only to divisible bodies, as it is proved in the physics. According to Plato, however, that which moves itself is not a body. Plato understood by motion any given operation, so that to understand and to judge are a kind of motion. Aristotle likewise touches upon this manner of speaking in the De Anima. Plato accordingly said that the first mover moves himself because he knows himself and wills or loves himself. In a way, this is not opposed to the reasons of Aristotle. There is no difference between reaching a first being that moves himself, as understood by Plato, and reaching a first being that is absolutely unmoved, as is understood by Aristotle. Okay, so that was essentially from a couple different angles and a couple different arguments to prove one of the first of the two propositions in the argument that of the unmoved mover, right? Namely, he said that there were two propositions that need to be proved. Everything is moved that is moved by another. Then the next half of this is that in movers and things moved, one cannot process to infinity. So and I know there's there's definitely a little more technical philosophical terms here, but I think the concept is pretty simple, right? Prescinding from all of the more technical terminology for a moment, the technical terminology is important. And it'll be good as we move through this to get familiar with these concepts, right? Act and potency. So we'll see later that God is perfect act. This unmoved mover is perfect act. So there's no potency in him. There's no changeability in him. But everything that's moved, there's that sequence of movers. So right now we've proven essentially that whatever is reduced to act has to be reduced to act, or has to be brought from potency to act by something else, right? So that's the nature of motion. So even in our bodies or in the body of an animal, you can't have part moving without it being influenced by another part, etc. So it's kind of fun to see how detailed Aristotle was in that, like, he looks at how an animal moves, he looks at how a body moves, he looks at something, whether it moves of its own accord or is moved by something else, moved by violence, as he says, right? So it's very interesting how thorough. Tomorrow we'll get to the second proposition of that first argument, and then that would conclude the first proof of God's existence. And I believe he's going to get to all five of the major proofs that I mentioned yesterday. What's beautiful, though, which is alluded to here, there's a misconception that there's this contradiction between Plato and Aristotle, that they're kind of on different ends of the spectrum. And Thomas alludes to it here, but I think we'll see as we continue to move through this, because Plato always said, oh, the forms are out there, all of the, the forms of things, the true identities of things are all in these like abstract out there, up in God or up in the ether or whatever, right? But Plato says, no, they're down here in things. The forms are in things. Look, the form of dog is in dog. The form of man is in man somehow, right? They're there. And what we find with a careful reading is that they're both saying essentially the same thing, but emphasizing something different, because both of them would also say that the forms, Plato would also say that the forms are in things, but he says that, and that's how we can arrive at and understand the forms that are in the mind of God. He didn't call it that way, but that's how we would understand it now. Whereas while Aristotle also acknowledges that there's forms in the mind of God, or in our minds actually as well, through and as we know, our intelligence participates in the mind of God and the intelligence of God. But Aristotle focuses on and emphasizes rather the forms in things. So we'll see, there is really not a contradiction between those two. It's a different emphasis. So it's very interesting. But then it begs the question too, as we move through this, it'll beg the question how we can talk about God governing creation, or how did God create all things if he can't, if there's no movement in him, if he's an unmoved mover, how does he move other things? It's kind of a mystery a little bit. But anyway, so we'll dig into all of those questions as well. But it's really exciting. So this first thing is, he's just proving that everything that's moved has to be moved by another thing. Even the sun and the stars are moved by something. And his argument is basically, when you get back to that first unmoved mover, which we'll see the necessity of tomorrow, that you can't have that movement in an infinite series, right? We'll look at that, and in that case, then what? It's not. We'll see tomorrow that it's not reasonable to say that there's an infinite progression of movers, and that thing that's unmoved, that's what we're going to call God. So very limited claims here, which is beautiful, because it's just kind of establishing what we can establish with the thought process, rather than trying to overextend ourselves in terms of what's being argued or proposed. So, if you want to catch up and get a refresher, of course, we need to stop here for today, because to open the next section, to go into the next premise, would go beyond the time we have for this morning. But yes, so I look forward to continuing this with you tomorrow. And I appreciate you joining me for Cup of Jonah this morning. Don't forget, phoneboothcopodcast.substack.com as always. At Jonah Stormrider at Spotify for all of these episodes. That's the easiest way to catch up. That between that and the phoneboothpodcast.substack under the Philosopher King tab. But don't forget to check out all the other great content. There was a really interesting episode put out by Ted and Vince on Monday. Some bonus content where they go through this interview with Epstein, and it's very interesting. So check that out. But definitely, yeah, it's a pleasure having you guys here, and appreciate you joining me for another Cup of Jonah. This one's a little shorter than usual, but just taking off bite-size readings here. So tomorrow we'll continue this 13th chapter that establishes the 5 proofs of God's existence. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you tomorrow.